The release of Caverns of Ixalan brings with it 4 new Commander Precon decks, each focusing on a specific creature type. We have a dinosaur deck, a vampire deck, a merfolk deck, and a pirate deck. In this video, I'll be breaking down one of the 4 deck lists for you, giving you an in-depth look at some of the new legendary creatures, the new cards, the better reprints, and then a budget-friendly guide on upgrading each of these decks. Without further ado, let's begin. In this video, we will be discussing the Explorers of the Deep deck, a blue and green deck that focuses on the merfolk creature type while also utilizing the Explore mechanic to create a field of large, evasive merfolk and value engines. Explore was one of the keyword mechanics from the original Ixalan block and works as follows. When you explore, you reveal the top card of your library. If that's a land card, you can add it to your hand. Otherwise, you put a +1/+1 counter onto the creature that's exploring, then put the revealed card back to the top of your library or into the graveyard. This ability creates a powerful resource engine. Explore acts in some ways as an advanced form of Scry, letting you dig into the top card of your library and either getting a guaranteed land drop in a future turn or a larger creature. Pitching the revealed card into the graveyard will also help you set up future plays depending on how much into your graveyard your deck plays. Our face commander of the Explorers of the Deep commander deck actually goes in hard with the Explore mechanic. Hawkball of the Surging Soul is a 3/3 for 4 mana, which breaks down to 2 of any color and then 1 each of green and blue for a merfolk scout. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each merfolk creature you control explores. Also, whenever Hawkball attacks, you can put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and if you don't, draw a card. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this is likely one of the most powerful engines I've ever seen on a merfolk legend. Merfolk tend to go wide, oftentimes creating a number of token creatures, having multiple lord creatures in play to bolster their size. Giving each of them an explore trigger will not only let you process a good chunk of your deck by exploring the top card of your library multiple times, but you can also potentially size up your board state to a point that your opponents cannot handle. Beyond that, having the attack trigger either ramp your lands, which I will also note come into play untapped, or drawing you a card is such brutally powerful upside in colors that already want to do both of these things in droves. Now, it is somewhat unfortunate that Hawkball entirely power crept the previous go-to for Simic Merfolk with Kumena, Tyrant of Vraska, who was also in the deck. Kumena was for a long time a value engine on his own, taking advantage of having plenty of Merfolk to tap for value. You could tap 1 merfolk and make him unblockable that turn. You could tap 3 merfolk to draw a card. Lastly, you could tap 5 merfolk to put a +1/+1 counter onto each of your merfolk. Now, because none of these abilities required you tap down Kumena, you could do this ability as many times as you had merfolk to tap for the cost. Kumena was, and I think still is, a beast, going in hard with the card draw and the bolster abilities, but now that Hawkball has entered the fray, I think Kumena can retire to just being part of the 99. I mentioned Kumena here specifically because while we do have other options for the lead commander in the deck that some are new cards altogether, I think Kumena is still strong enough that you could theoretically swap this out to be your commander without having to do a major overhaul of the deck. Another new option for the deck is Nikanzel Current Conductor, who is 2 mana, 1 each of green and blue for a 2/3. Whenever a creature you control explores and a land card is revealed, you may put that card onto the battlefield tapped under your control. Whenever a non-land card is revealed through an exploration, you can put a +1/+1 counter onto Nikanzel. This card has a lot of synergies with the Explore mechanic and allows us additional value for revealing those lands, almost more so than our main commander. Even though those lands enter play tapped, they are not costing us our land drop per turn, and we can get multiples through it, and so we can get more mana ramp using this method. However, I feel like these abilities are more passive than I would want on my commander, and so while I really feel like Nikanzel is incredibly powerful and can scale nicely, I'd rather they be part of the 99 as just another useful value engine. The third new option for the deck is Zolotoyuk the Smiling Flood, who is not a merfolk but does greatly help the deck strategy. For 6 mana, you get a 6/6 Salamander Serpent. Whenever Zolotoyuk enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a flood counter onto a target land. That land is now an island in addition to its other types, so long as it has that flood counter on it. But at the beginning of your end step, untap each permanent that you control that has a flood counter on it. I personally love this card. I love the big doofy smile on it as a start, and on a mechanical side, this card does so much for Merfolk that I do think it will remain in the deck. See, I approached upgrading this deck by modeling it after what the modern Merfolk deck tries to do. Some of the Merfolk Lord creatures not only grant power and toughness boosts, but Island Walk as well. Creatures that have Island Walk cannot be blocked at all if the defending player controls an island. By putting a flood counter onto just a single land, you will effectively turn on the Island Walk. There are only a handful of cards throughout Magic's history that also can turn lands into islands one way or another, and by turning our creatures into unblockable threats, it becomes a lot harder to defend against our board state. This is especially so considering our exploring creatures might start accumulating +1/+1 counters. Lastly, while I'm not going to get into as much detail as we did with the previous 3, we do have an additional 5 cards that are all legendary Merfolk who are in the colors that could be used right out of the box, who I'm not as much of a fan of. These are Merfolk, but their synergies towards what this deck wants to do are a bit more shallow, and so if I'm going to be cutting spell slots for upgrades, these are unfortunately going to be the contenders. They either cost too much to cast, don't have as much of an impact for what their mana cost is, or they have roles that could be filled with better cards. I do feel like while these are some great options for commander decks on their own, in the case of this Precon deck, I do feel like they need to go. So now that we've discussed the commander options that you can use right out of the box, let's look at some of the better new cards in the deck, shall we? Deeproot Historian gives both Merfolk and Druid cards in your graveyard Retrace. Retrace lets you cast the cards with the ability from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to their other costs. So with our Explore ability, we can pitch those non-land cards to the graveyard, and then with the Historian, we can cast them from the graveyard. In a themed deck like this, the majority of our creatures will be Merfolk, and so we can easily pitch them to the graveyard to play later. In some ways, this card will extend our graveyard's utility to act as almost a second hand. Do note that this card merely states Merfolk cards, and so some of the Kindred cards that are not creatures but contain the type of Merfolk are still technically valid targets. Singer of the Swift Rivers has an ETB ability that puts a shield counter onto a target creature we control. Shield counters act as a bit of a protection from being destroyed either by lethal damage or an ability, and are largely similar to the regeneration ability from older cards. In addition, you can cast Merfolk spells as though they had flash. That's the ability that I care about much more, as it offers us an on-theme flash enabler, letting us hold up our spells and utilize our Merfolk as surprise threats. Because this too has flash, we can hold up our best Merfolk in hand until your opponent's end step, just before our turn comes around, then drop this in, followed by some other fishy friends. This circumvents summoning sickness, letting you start your turn with a fresh board state of cards that your opponents didn't see coming. Topography Tracker has an ETB that creates a map token. Map tokens are artifact tokens that, for 1 mana, tapping and sacrifice them, target creature explores, but only at sorcery speed. The tracker also has a static replacement ability that, if a creature you control would explore, instead it explores, then it explores again. This doubles your explore triggers, and going back to our commander giving our entire board a singular explore trigger, you're doubling all of those as well, and so this is going to get out of hand very quickly. Tributary Instructor has Mentor, where whenever this creature attacks, you can put a +1/+1 counter onto a target attacking creature with lesser power. Also, whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter dies, you draw a card. This is a lot of value here. The Instructor is base power 4/4, meaning most of our board will be small enough to benefit from the Mentor ability. This will also give a lot more possible card draw triggers off of that second ability, and this too synergizes well with the Explore mechanic. We can choose to put a +1/+1 counter onto the creature that explores should it not reveal a land card, and so this deck will result in some +1/+1 counter strategies as a tertiary strategy. So now let's discuss some of the better reprints in this deck. You'll more than likely want to keep these cards in the deck, as they're going to give you the best value for what the deck is trying to do. Cold Ice Selkie has Island Walk, meaning it's unblockable if the defending player controls an island. Whenever the Selkie deals combat damage to a player, you may draw that many cards. Now this scales really nicely with the Explore mechanic, as unlike many other Curiosity style abilities, the amount of damage that you are dealing is directly converted into the same amount of cards drawn. If this starts to get bigger based on the Explore triggers, you might begin to see this card drawing you 3, 4, even 5 cards per combat. With the sheer amount of card draw that this can return, I actually felt more comfortable not adding in some of the usual card draw suspects with our upgrades. Deeproot Elite is a cheap to cast Merfolk and has a powerful ability. Whenever another Merfolk enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter onto a target Merfolk you control. We can use this to bulk up a single merfolk like the Cold Eye Selkie, or we can simply make that merfolk entering the battlefield a little bigger. On that same note, Emperor Mihail II lets us cast our merfolk from the top of our library, and then whenever we cast a merfolk spell, we can pay 1 additional mana to create a 1/1 merfolk token. This is one of those cards that's going to help us go wide with the tokens. Again, going back to the Deeproot Elite, these creature tokens can technically come in as a 2/2. As we begin to create more and more of these creature tokens, our board state will begin to overpower whatever our opponents are putting up to defend themselves. And as we'll see with our next card, those board states might not even stand a chance. Herald of the Secret Streams is perhaps my favorite card in this deck. It has one simple ability. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them cannot be blocked. I normally put in cards like Pride Malkin to give trample to the creatures I control with +1/+1 counters, but the Herald being a merfolk and therefore being more on theme is perfect to make my board state beyond trample-y and just entirely unblockable. Our creatures are getting bigger from the Explore triggers and the Deeproot Elite style cards. Suddenly those giant merfolk can't be blocked at all, and so it'll make quick work for our opponents. Kopala, Warden of Waves, offers a sort of pre-ward ability to our merfolk, making them much harder to target with spells and abilities, which, considering how large they're going to be getting from the +1/+1 counters and the unblockability, they're also now going to be safe from removal and targeted interaction. We also have a selection of merfolk lords in the way of Master of the Pearl Trident, Merfolk Mistbinder, Merfolk Sovereign, Merfolk Regery, who each grant our merfolk +1/+1, in addition to some of these cards granting other boons like Unblockable or Island Walk. These cards being in play will help strengthen our board state, meaning we will only need a few creatures actually swinging to close out games. Metallic Mimic is technically a merfolk when it enters the battlefield, and it allows our other merfolk to enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on them. Seafloor Oracle is another card draw engine, giving us 1 card whenever a merfolk connects to a player. Stonybrook Manta makes our merfolk and wizard spells cost 1 less to cast. Merfolk decks operate the best with a very low mana curve, and so by using cards like this to give a discount on some of those mana costs, we'll be able to extend further during our turns. Inspiring Call is a great alternative to Heroic Intervention, letting you draw a lot of cards and protect all of your creatures so long as they have +1/+1 counter on them. Branching Evolution is probably the best reprint in the deck, letting us double the amount of +1/+1 counters that we're putting on creatures. I would say we probably wouldn't even need something like Doubling Season in this deck, because this does so much of the legwork for so much less mana. Deeproot Waters gives us a 1/1 merfolk with hexproof whenever we cast a merfolk spell. This will be another way to go wide with our tokens and give us some more expendable forces. Hardened Scales is similar to the Branching Evolution, but for only a single mana, and it only gives 1 additional +1/+1 counter. This might not seem like much, but that's a lot of extra value when you start seeing all of your creatures growing by +2/+2 whenever they explore. Kindred Discovery will let us draw a card whenever a merfolk enters the battlefield or attacks. That's a ton of value that allowed me to omit cards like Rhystic Study or Mystic Remora. Simic Ascendancy is an alternate win con in this deck, and so I'm very happy they included it. Whenever you put any number of +1/+1 counters onto a creature you control, you also put that many growth counters onto the Simic Ascendancy. And at the beginning of your upkeep, should the Ascendancy have 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. 20 counters is nothing for a deck like this. The only drawback to this card is its entire lack of protection. It has neither hexproof nor shroud nor indestructible. But depending on how fast you're able to go with your game, that might not even be necessary. We have a lot of doubling effects for the Explore triggers as well as cards that increase the +1/+1 counter production, so this might go live pretty quickly. So the strategy that we have going on is getting merfolk onto the battlefield, letting them explore and grow larger while generating us value, and then making them unblockable to close out the games. If we play the deck correctly, we can easily swing in with huge unblockable protected creatures. But I want to offer some cards to upgrade the deck, and so I will take a look at some of the cards that you can add to the deck to refine it to your tastes. With one stipulation, I will only be spending $30 on new cards, so unfortunately no expensive staples. To start from the Caverns of Ixalan set, we have Deeproot Pilgrimage, which is similar to the Deeproot Waters that's already in the deck, but I think this one is perhaps a little better, giving us a 1/1 merfolk with hexproof whenever a non-token merfolk we control is tapped. We also have Twists and Turns, an enchantment that impacts the Explore triggers. If a creature you control would explore, instead you first scry one and then the creature explores. When it enters the battlefield, a target creature you control explores. Then, when a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, the card transforms into Mycoid Maze, a cave land that can tap for a green. You can also pay 4 and tap it to look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal a creature card from among them and add it to your hand, and then the rest go to the bottom of your library in a random order. The front face of this card is an excellent way to make your Explore triggers work out more in your favor. Sometimes you'll want to have a land revealed, other times you'll want a non-land, and with this in play, you'll have a little bit more control over what you're going to see. We also have the pair of Forerunner of the Heralds and Marrow Harbinger, both of which let us search for a Merfolk card to put on the top of our library. If you're hurting for more tutors, these are excellent budget options and are well within the Merfolk theme we're going for. Sentinel of the Nameless City reminds me of the Titan cycle. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, we create a map token. This will give us an additional opportunity to do the Explore mechanic, and since it has Vigilance, we're able to swing with it without having to worry about it being able to block later. I also want to bring in some additional redundancy with Lord of Atlantis, giving us another instance of Island Walk and +1/+1 Lordage. This and Master of the Pearl Trident are some of the best lords that we can get into play, and with some of the additional cards that we'll be talking about in just a moment, we're going to be able to turn on that Island Walk very easily. Aquatex Will and Spreading Seas both make a land into an island. The Aquatex Will provides a flood counter similar to what our Happy Salamander Boy offers. Tidal Warrior can tap to turn a target land into an island until the end of turn, again being a nice neat option to turn on Island Walk. Quicksilver Fountain is amazing tech in here, as it forces each player to make one of their lands into an island, which will in turn turn on our Island Walk for that player. But at the end of the turn, if all of the lands in play are islands, we remove all the flood counters from all of the lands. That last ability will likely never get off, as we're going to probably have won the game by that point. It's important to note that for a lot of these cards, they can simply turn the land into an island. No other types, no other abilities. Whatever land it was before, it is that land type no more. Some others, such as Zolotoic, simply add island onto that land's types, which might be less beneficial than outright blood mooning it. Deep Fathom Echo is a cool clone type card that explores at the beginning of combat on your turn, then it can turn into a copy of any other creature you control until the end of turn. This can be relevant and give us some double value on some of our better creatures, though do be mindful that this does not bypass the legendary rule. Lull Mage Mentor is perhaps one of the strongest merfolk you can add to the deck, not only letting you create a 1/1 merfolk whenever you counter a spell, but letting you tap 7 merfolk that are untapped you control to counter a target spell. This can be a tremendous benefit to your board state, holding up 7 merfolk, which can include itself, in response to a problematic removal or even a board wipe, makes this devastating tech. Marrow Commerce is another fun enchantment for merfolk, letting you untap all of your merfolk at your end step. This gives, in effect, your creature's vigilance and can be a valuable tool if you're tapped out. Vodalian Hexcatcher has Flash, making it an instant speed problem, and it's a lord, but its true value lets us sacrifice a merfolk to counter a target non-creature spell unless its controller plays 1 additional mana. You can also do this multiple times, forcing an opponent to pay that 1 additional mana multiple times should they really want that non-creature spell to resolve. This is, in a way, a budget on-theme variant of Flusterstorm, and being on-theme to the merfolk makes it all the better. Now, while not specifically merfolk support, Neoform and Filter Out both add substantial value to the deck. Neoform is basically a creature tutor that lets us upgrade a creature, sacrificing it to bring out another creature with 1 more mana in the cost, and then we put a +1/+1 counter on it, which, considering what our deck is doing, is immediate upside. Filter Out is a budget option of Cyclonic Rift. It handles all the non-creature, non-land cards, and considering the majority of our deck is creature-based, this can clear up a lot of problem cards at instant speed. Lastly, it's not in the deck, but it absolutely could and should be. Talisman of Curiosity is another useful mana rock at the 2-drop slot. It's very boring to mention, but you want the bulk of your deck to be around the 2 to 3 mana slots. These 17 cards will help bolster the main strategies of your deck and give you additional valuable merfolk while only really costing you about $30. But if you have pricier cards you'd like to add, like Breeding Pool or, dare I say it, Thassa's Oracle, you can of course always include them. But as it stands, the mana base for this deck works rather well on its own, and these additions will really help your deck hone in on the Merfolk strategy. My final thoughts on the deck: for someone wanting to get into a Merfolk themed deck, this is an excellent starting point. You get a tremendous assortment of valuable Merfolk cards, a strategy that offers you win conditions and value engines right out of the box. There is plenty of room to upgrade simply by removing just the excessive legendary creatures that don't quite cut it, and so the ceiling for this deck is actually quite high. I think the strategy is very fun and flavorful, and I think it's one of my favorite decks from recent Magic sets. I'm also willing to say that it's probably one of the stronger ones. Merfolk are very synergistic. But let's turn the mic to you. What do you think of this deck? Other cards you'd recommend to folks wanting to tinker with this? Let's discuss it in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit the like button, as it really helps us navigate the algorithm. And if you're new here, remember to hit subscribe to never miss a video. I appreciate your time, I hope you enjoyed your stay here, and as always, I'll see you all next video.